Hello and welcome to Groovecast, the podcast for the rhythm section with me, Ashley Walker.
And me, Charlie Smith.
And today we're going to be talking about a couple of things that when we started the podcast about a year ago, these were sort of the type of discussions that we really wanted to have, and coming back for our second season here, we wanted to waste no time and get straight down to it. So in this episode we're going to be talking about iconic albums. And specifically in this one, we're going to be talking about the album Asia and the album The Dude by Quincy Jones. So let's get straight into it. I've got a little bit of spiel here that Charlie's looking forward to about Asia. So Asia, if you're not aware, was Steely Dan's sixth studio album. It was released on the 23rd of September 1977. It involved almost 40 musicians, including Michael McDonald, Larry Carlton, Wayne Shorter, Lee Ritenour, Jay Graydon, Steve Gadd, and the Eagles bassist Timothy B. Schmidt, among many, many more. The album became Steely Dan's most commercially, I should say, successful, and in the years and decades since its release, it has increasingly become one of the most influential albums of all time. So, whew. Yeah, that's
out the way now.
Yeah.
So I think when we were starting to get thinking about this sort of iconic albums, I'm going to call it a series, which is what I think it'll probably become. At least it'll be done over multiple episodes, discussing a myriad of albums and favourites of ours, and some absolute classics as well, I'm sure. But yeah, couldn't think of a better couple of albums to kick it off with. This Asia in particular has always been probably my favourite Steely Dan album, because I think it's just one of the most complete albums ever. It's one of those where you can listen down it, and I'm sure we'll get more into this later, but there's not one track that you would want to skip past. You want to listen to every track. And I think that'll probably become a theme with a lot of the albums that we look at, is that they, in a way that maybe you don't see as much with a lot of the kind of more commercial artists now and again, everything is done with a lot of thought. It wasn't necessarily about what would sell or what would be commercially viable. It was all about what would be musically right.
Yeah.
And that's, I mean, definitely with Steely Dan, that's always been their approach. Hence why there's over 40 different musicians on this particular album. Or is it almost 40? I forget which side it lands.
Yeah.
Almost.
Somewhere
Anyway,
around there.
Around 40. So it's one of those where, and the Steely Dan way, sort of from their, once they were a few albums in, was always to hire the right people for the right song, which I really like. And to be honest, I don't think he would really manage that nowadays with budgets and everything that comes together. So it's pretty a pretty amazing achievement when you look at it now, of the amount of time, effort, and money that will have gone into any of these albums, especially these two today. But yeah, let's just run it down a little bit. The track listing, is kind of always the first place that I tend to go on an album.
Yeah, and I think what's great about this, as you said, this series, as we go on with it, is I'm not sure if it's the same for you, because I know that, as you said, this is one of your favourite albums. It's certainly one of mine. But I didn't know, although we've all seen the kind of documentaries about the players that were involved in it, I didn't know about the producers and all that kind of thing. And in sort of preparing for this, I had a little read up of one of the producers involved. I think there was a lot of different people involved in it, but one of them was a guy called Gary Katz, who previously had worked with Shaka Khan, the Mamas and Papas, Jimmy Buffett, and he'd also worked on Can't Buy a Thrill, Steely Dan's earlier album, and after Asia, he went on to produce Gaucho, the next album, and also Donald Fagen's solo album, Nightfly. So
yeah.
and then looking at also at the mastering, a guy called Bernie Grunman, who worked on before this. I think the only real major thing he'd worked on was an Earth, Wind and Fire album. But after this album, he went on to master the Grease soundtrack and Thriller, amongst other things. So, you're talking about like getting the best players and the best people. It goes even not just players, mastering and producing, and you can really tell with this album.
Yeah, and again, even further than that, if you were to really look into it, they'll be in the best studios with the best engineers and all the best, the most modern kit of the time, to get the absolute most out of it, which is what they did.
Yeah.
And where today it gets taken for granted a bit that we've got everything at our fingertips on a laptop. Back then, it was all pretty much analog. You were still working, still by then probably still recording to tape.
Yeah.
Which isn't a thing now, really, as much as it was then.
No.
So everything was so thought out. And I mean, as you were saying there with Gary Katz also doing Can't Buy a Thrill, that's probably my second favourite Steely Dan album. And so you can definitely see there's a lineage of what sounds great and them getting the right people in for the job.
Yeah.
And that was for me always what Steely Dan, being Donald Fagen and Walter Becker, were absolutely spot on at doing. And I mean, you read down the track listing, and it's just, it's 7 tracks of brilliance. I mean, you got Black Cow as the opener, which is a really solid kind of plodding along, funky tune with it, where so much about what we love about some of these albums, especially when they've got a bit of feel and a bit of funk to them, is always about the groove. But what Steely Dan also did, which I love, is they really had the lyrics right. So every song on this tells a story, and it all has a bit of storytelling to it, which is really genius as well, backed up with pretty incredible music.
Yeah.
So yeah, Black Cow's a really solid opener, and you've got Chuck Rainey on bass, Larry Carlton on guitar, Paul Humphrey on drums, and it's just a really, really solid opener to the album. And then moving on into what's probably the most iconic track, or one of them, the title track, Asia, which is, I mean, it's just a melting pot of greatness. You got again Larry Carlton and Chuck Rainey on there. You've got Wayne Shorter on sax, Steve Gadd on drums, Denny Dias on guitar, who's founding member of Steely Dan, and then, as you mentioned in your opener, Timothy B. Schmidt on backing vocals.
Yeah.
Who, as you say, went on to be
bassist for the Eagles.
Bassist for the Eagles. Yeah, that was it. I couldn't get Earth, Wind and Fire out of my head for a moment there.
No,
I had a complete blank.
It's unbelievable though. Like I said, reading up on this album, I knew obviously the people like Chuck Rainey and Larry Carlton were involved, and they're probably two of the most constant players on this album. And then obviously you've got Steve Gadd on Asia playing that ridiculous, solo at the end. But I had no idea that it was Wayne Shorter on at sax, and then Timothy Schmidt doing backing vocals on quite a few of the tracks as well. I think as we run down them,
Yeah, and I mean, Asia's just, it's one of those that really evokes a mood when you listen to it. You get that almost Eastern feel to it through just, not even through instrumentation, but just choice of voicings and chords and harmonic choices as well as rhythmic choices that just make it really have a really evocative kind of sound to it, which it's something you don't hear too often. Something really trying to pull at the story and pull at the lyrics to get that sound. And then as you mentioned, we have a Steve Gadd drum solo in there, which for me is always a bonus on a track, and something that you don't hear very often. I mean, who puts drum solos on songs? And it's not a common thing, but it was the right place, and they got the right player to do it. And apparently,
sorry, go on.
I think he Gad just came in and sight read it, on the day. Maybe he had a couple of quick playthroughs, but he was reading the chart as he played the tune.
And I think you can tell with that as well. I mean, with quite a lot of Steve Gadd's classic drum things, you can tell it's not. He didn't necessarily have it pre-planned in his head. This is I've played something like this or that kind of feel. You can tell it was probably different if they did more than one take of his drum solo, which I think they did. Like none of them would have been exactly the same because you can tell it's just all off the cuff, kind of thing.
Yeah, but as well as it being off the cuff, it's totally signature to Gadd. When you hear what he's playing on a drummer level, you hear those kind of thematic ideas that Gadd became known for. Using the triplet Rattler McHugh setups and some of the other the other phrasing and things that he put into there just made it quintessentially recognisable. It's one of those where you can listen to it and you know immediately who it is. There's no doubting who played it, and to get to that level for any musician's something pretty special.
Yeah, and then you go on again, and I think the last track on side A, Deacon Blues, another track that, like you said, one of these albums where, for me, one of the rare albums where I can listen to it all the way through and love every track, and you move on for a monster like Asia, and then a really nice track like Deacon Blues, which had Larry Carlton again, but this time Lee Ritenour on guitar as well, which I think you can kind of hear his little stamp on it,
Yeah, and then Purdy on drums, which you can hear just sitting and grooving away at the back, just keeping it really solid. And we'll come to the Purdy stamp later on, I'm sure, when we get into side B, and we start to get to the shuffles. But again, it's just when you come out of a real monster of a track, as you say, to go into something smooth and laid back and just with a really great groove, which is what Deacon Blues is, it makes it a really good closer. And it's something that a lot of the average listeners don't think about, but the way they order the tracks can really make or break an album.
Absolutely.
And with this, I think they got it absolutely bang on, because there's so much light and shade, but it still flows. And I think the genius of Steely Dan is that they had, and I think we've mentioned this on the podcast before, having all these players on one album could make it sound like 7 different albums as you listen down it, but it doesn't. It still sounds cohesive, even though you've got these different players, these different approaches, these different sounds. It all still sounds like a Steely Dan album.
Yeah, and I think like the key to that, although funnily enough on Deacon Blues it was Walter Becker on bass, I think one of the keys to that was having Chuck Rainey near enough on every track. And also then obviously you've got Walter Becker, although he doesn't play on every track, and Donald Fagen is on every track. It's like, just goes to show how much, how deliberate it was, and that they must have had some sort of map in their head of the sound of the album, because you've got all these different players in it. Like you say, it doesn't sound like 7 different tracks from different albums. It's excellent.
Yeah, and then flipping to side B, we've got, I know you like my sneaky pun in there, I thought I couldn't resist it, but we come on to Peg, which is probably, it's up there in my favourites from the album. It's hard to pick a favourite when they're all so good, but Peg's definitely up there. I mean, the way that Rick Marotta and Chuck Rainey locked together in the drum and bass department there is something pretty special.
I think on that, you can check it out on YouTube after this, obviously, after you've watched this or listened. There's that video as well of them talking about it, and they isolate the bass and drums, and it's so different because the kick drum and the bass aren't together. Like, it's you got the bass doing that sort of funky slap thing in the chorus, and which Chuck Rainey slipped in without them realising, because they didn't want slap on it. And then you've got Rick Marotta playing a really syncopated feel with his kick drum, but it just grooves. You wouldn't kind of pick on it unless you see stuff like that. Yeah, excellent.
Yeah, I think that comes from the Classic Albums documentary, which is also completely worth checking out for this album and all of the other albums that series has gone through over the years. But it goes into great detail. Also, when they isolate some of the guitar solos that were put on this, because I think they went through a good few players and a couple of days' work before Jay Graydon came in and put that kind of Hawaiian slide solo on it.
Yeah.
Which, when you listen to the others, all of them were great solos, but they weren't as right as what ended up on the album. And there's always those great stories from different musicians who've been and done sessions for Steely Dan, and it was like you wouldn't know if you were on the album until it came out.
Yeah.
Because you do your session, and there's half a chance that they'd got to the end of the day or the end of the week and gone, yeah, we're going to start again. We're going to do it differently. And I think everything would be wiped.
And I think one of the brilliant things again about it is you've got Walter Becker there, who's again a brilliant guitarist in his own right. And I think in that documentary and in that video, he says he had to go at the solo himself and wasn't happy with it. So to have the Bottle to say and not to let your ego go, say I want to have another go, and to bring in someone like Jay Graydon and back to that thing of them knowing kind of the set, what they wanted it to sound like in their head. I think as soon as he put that guitar solo down, they pretty much knew that was going to be the one.
Yeah, for sure. And huge props on this has to go to Michael McDonald as well for the BVs on Peg, because they are something just incredibly special
and really tight harmonies. Like it's not like the type of harmonies and intervals and stuff that you would usually hear. But if there's somebody who's going to lay it down like that, it would be Michael McDonald, wouldn't it?
Yeah, and again, when you hear those in isolation, it's like an absolute wall of sound. So tight with each other, and so well crafted that, as you say, it couldn't be anyone else to do it. And yeah, Michael McDonald just went in there and absolutely caned it on the BVs, and I think they I don't know how many tracks they'll have used just for backing vocals and layering all those sounds up, but yeah, it really adds something special to an already great track.
And moving on to this the second track on side B, which I'm going to throw a curveball in there, is probably my favourite track on the album. I'm not sure why. Probably something to do with Bernard Purdie on drums on it, At Home at Last.
Yeah, again, what a tune. I mean, this is coming out of Peg, which is syncopated and up-tempo and, has a bit of drive to it. Then you're into Home at Last, which is the most laid-back, half-time shuffle, Purdie shuffle sort of classic that's just complete chalk and cheese to what you've just heard, but still not only an amazing song in its own right, but it flows straight after that. Sort of really just kind of two opposite songs that sit together nicely.
Yeah.
And yeah, definitely Purdie on the drums and again Chuck Rainey laying it down. Larry Carlton on guitar, and then Walter Becker playing the solo on this one, which is really cool. And yeah, again, just another well thought out track. And Donald Fagen and Walter Becker, although they could be pretty hard taskmasters in the studio, they knew why they were doing it, and they had full right to do and to work how they did, because they got the results.
Yeah.
And what they got out at the end of it was something really amazing.
Yeah. And then again, like just looking down this track list, and then the next track, I Got the News, just smashing it out the park, like on this side B. Just another monster of a track.
Well, that's it, and another drummer. You got Ed Green on this one, and you've got both Larry Carlton and Walter Becker taking solos on it, and again, it just builds up this another great track. And I think that's probably one of the tracks that slips under the radar of most people when they think of when they think of the album, because they think of the big hitters like Peg or like Home at Last or Josie or whatever, and they forget sometimes about the not the lesser tracks, but the tracks that aren't as played outside of the album. Not the sort that you wouldn't hear on the radio or you wouldn't hear too often anywhere else unless you listen to that album.
Yeah, and it's so tight as well, and again you've got another outstanding performance from Michael McDonald on the harmonies and the backing vocals in sort of that middle section. And actually, when I think about it, quite similar to Peg in it's like almost barbershop style like harmonies in the closeness of them. And then you've got a really sort of odd. I'm not sure if I guess it is a guitar solo, but there's a sort of really strange little solo in it, in the middle of it, and you'd kind of listen to it. If it was in any other context, you'd think that's a bit of a not, your standard solo, but it just works perfectly for the track.
Yeah, it was just having the right approach again that made what they do perfect. And then to round it all out, we have a track that I know is a mutual favourite of ours, which is Josie as a closing track. And again, just reading down the names who are on it, you got Jim Keltner on drums, who again an amazing player and a really signature style of playing that when you hear it, you kind of it's a Keltner track.
Yeah.
Dean Parks and Larry Carlton on guitars. Again, Walter Becker playing the solo, and Victor Feldman on Rhodes, Fender Rhodes, organ. And it just, again, has such a great feel to it. That kind of funky, really smooth feel.
Yeah.
That even when we did it, we couldn't quite get that close, but we had a try at it, which you can find on online if you look for it.
I think as well, making this like this type of series, we were sort of discussing how to run through it and everything, and it was with especially monster albums like these two and like Asia, we couldn't possibly mention everybody involved, and even just on each track we've missed people out. But certainly one of the unsung heroes is Victor Feldman, because when sort of writing about, I knew he was Fender Rhodes on this one, but I think on most of the tracks he's doing either percussion or Fender Rhodes, or but you can go and check it out for yourself, all the monster musicians that are involved in it. But yeah, like you said, we had to go at this one, and I think it was pretty close, pretty good.
Yeah, it wasn't bad for a 3-piece.
Yeah.
But yeah, it is. It's just, and it is the right track to finish the album off, because you really do end the album on a high. After all of that, musical light and shade going through each of the tracks, you come out on this really nice, really upbeat tune, and it is. It's a really complete album, and it's hard to quantify it any other way. As although it's 7 very separate tracks, once you put them all together, they belong together.
Yeah, and again, like doing this video and looking through it all, like to see that there are only 7 tracks on it as well, I couldn't believe it, because even though I've played in bass lessons and stuff, played through all these songs, I just thought there were more than that. Maybe because some of them are long, and then they just go. You just sort of know after each track. I don't know what it's like for you, but when I listen to it on or streaming it or whatever, it's like I know what the next track's going to be when that one finishes. You know what the intro to the next one's going to be. It just all sort of goes into each other perfectly.
Yeah, it's so recognisable, and it just seems to work. As unlikely as it may have sounded at the time, they made the right choices musically to bring it all together, and that's why it's one of my favourites, and I think will always remain so, because it's just an utterly perfect album, and everything about it just works. There's no as we said, there's nothing on there that you listen to and think, yeah, that could have been done better, or that sounds like it was rushed a little bit, or they didn't really take the time over it. Everything was meticulously done.
And you hear about these albums, like iconic albums from the 60s, and people like Phil Spector and the Wrecking Crew and all that kind of thing. And whereas, I mean, there was a lot of deliberate stuff in that, but quite a lot of the brilliance happened sort of accidentally. With an album like Asia, it was all, they wanted it to sound that way, and they got exactly what they wanted, which I think is kind of even more brilliant.
Yeah, they had the complete foresight that they knew what they wanted to hear on everything. And, even though they didn't know the specifics of it, when they heard it, they were like, yeah, that's the one. That's what we need to get. And, when you listen to all of the players who went on to do the album, and then you look at where they went after that, and it was one of those where, it really became that album that skyrocketed a load of session players to do even bigger things. Yeah, and I think even though it was, like we said in the intro, it was commercially successful at the time, I think it's kind of even more so since the social media and all that kind of thing, that certainly young musicians and musicians that are into sort of funk and groove, and now that all these session players like Purdy and Chuck Rainey are starting to get the recognition that they deserve, For sure.
Yeah.
It's good that it's come around and it hasn't gotten lost into the midst of time, and that it's still probably as great sounding now as it was ever. And it's never dated itself either.
Yeah,
which is kind of interesting. It still sounds fresh, to me at least. It doesn't sound, like you listen to some older songs, older albums, and the sounds on it are a little bit dated, or it hasn't stood the test of time. But I think with this particular album, it most definitely has.
Yeah, and then we move on from that album, and we continue with another absolutely iconic album. That word's going to be used a lot, I think. Iconic.
Yeah, it's probably going to become the name of this series.
It's almost as though we thought of that.
We should have pre-planned this.
So I'll do a little bit of spiel again about this album. It's one of my absolute favourites. It's called The Dude by Quincy Jones. The Dude was a studio album released in 1981 by the iconic composer / producer / everything else, Quincy Jones. The album features a whole host of studio musicians and legends, including Abe Laboriel, Louis Johnson, Greg Fillinganes, Steve Lukather, David Foster, Herbie Hancock, John Robinson, also known as JR, and Stevie Wonder, among just a whole host, as I just said, of other musicians. It gained a lot of attention for its use of different genres, from jazz to rap and funk to rock. Not to mention, it also launched the career of the singer James Ingram. The album will be nominated for 12 Grammys, claiming 3 of them, and also won the aforementioned Ingram 3 Grammys as well. So as I said, this album is a Quincy Jones album. He produced, arranged, composed all the music and everything. And as I was just saying to Charlie before the video, it's worth mentioning as well, as he's like a local hero to musicians from Lincolnshire. A lot of the arrangements were also done by a guy called Rod Temperton, who's an absolute legend, did loads of the Michael Jackson stuff as well. And he happens to be from Cleethorpes, just up the road there, which always helps. So absolutely just iconic Charlie album.
Indeed it is. It's one of my favourites. In fact, again, like Asia was my favourite Steely Dan album, The Dude is definitely probably the top Quincy Jones album.
Yeah. Again, as I keep reiterating, and it's one of my favourite things about doing these like top 10 videos and top whatever. Like when we look into it and do our own little research, you learn stuff that I had no idea about, even though I love this album. And also just like this morning and yesterday, listening through this album again, I just realised how much I like it, and also similar to Asia, the contrast in the tracks. So we'll get straight into it on the first track, which is I Know Corrida, which is just an absolute belting track. I'm sure you'll agree.
Yeah, I mean, that's a track that I can't tell you the amount of times I've had that on driving back from a gig somewhere, because it just slaps you round the face. You know, it's big, it's funky, it's all there, you know. It's just a really well thought out and well composed, well arranged track. And you think, you know, what better way to open the album? And I think it's probably one of the most known tracks on the album as well. Correct me if I'm wrong.
I still, I think, although arguably other ones had more commercial success, I still hear I Know Corrida played on the radio sometimes.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
Late night on Radio 2 quite often is a good place to hear it. And every time it comes on, it's still, you know, you can bookend it, put it in between two really modern tracks, and it doesn't sound like, you know, it doesn't sound dated, it doesn't sound old. Like we were saying with Asia, it still stands up and still sounds great.
Yeah, and one of the things I wrote when making some notes on this was, what just strikes me about it is it's just like, for me, vintage Quincy Jones, and the style of it, which is his style, but it's like a cross between his work at the time with the Brothers Johnson, which, as I mentioned before, Louis Johnson on bass, who played on most of these tracks, the band that he was in, and his work at that time with Michael Jackson. So, and I think that's sort of the best way that I could think of sort of summing it up, is just a cross between those two, you know, the work he did with those two guys. And like with Asia, just the people that they got to play on these on these tracks, you know, on the first track you got Louis Johnson, who does a like great slap thing in the middle, and then you've got Steve Lukather, who played on it and did like the guitar solo in it. Herbie Hancock played on this track. Greg Fillinganes, which, as you mentioned before, it's like looking into the future at a future Toto lineup with Fillinganes and Steve Lukather on it.
Yeah, for sure. And then J.R. Robinson on kit, and I mean, J.R.'s a legendary player in his own right for the amount of work and sessions he's done, not only with Quincy doing this and also a lot of Michael Jackson stuff. You know, I mean, every time I hear Rock With You, the Michael Jackson thing, that's quintessential J.R. Robinson, because it's just really solid, funky, tight, you know, and it's the same approach on here. And then, of course, the other thing JR's known for doing was the Shaka Khan stuff, and some of those really iconic drum parts were JR's making, and he is a pretty legendary player, in my eyes at least. I think he's, and one that goes pretty underrated quite a lot.
Yeah, and it's, again, like the similarities between, which is kind of one of the reasons we picked these two albums to kick this off, was although they are very different albums, the similarity is, although there's probably more constant players on this album than Asia, there are a lot of different players that come into each track, but like Chuck Rainey or Larry Carlton or even Donald Fagen or Walter Becker being the constant on Asia, JR is like the constant on this album, which I think is key. And Louis Johnson is one of the constants, although we will get on to another bass player that was featured on this album.
For sure.
But yeah, great opening track. And then you move on to, obviously, the title track, The Dude, which is just so one of those words, again, that we use all the time, in the pocket, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, my favourite thing about this track has got to be the little stabs, because they're just so right and so funky, and the little variations that happen each time they come round, you know. And sometimes it's they hold it for a note and then come back in. Sometimes it's straight through. Yeah. So it has, even when you still listen to it now, knowing the song, it still has that unpredictability to it.
Yeah.
which is really nice, and it's always a kind of a moment that makes me smile when I hear those stabs, and it's just like, yeah, this is funky, and
Yeah.
everything's so tight and so well done.
And again, as I said, with Asia, we couldn't possibly mention everybody involved, especially on this album in terms of arrangements and synth programming and all that. There's so many people that we couldn't mention them all. But if you want to check out who did a lot of the horn arrangements, you should do that, because as we're going to mention on a few of these tracks, they are so key to it. Even though, as what we're all about groove, like people like Lewis Johnson and JR. It wouldn't be they wouldn't be the tracks they are without those monster horn arrangements.
Yeah, the brass really makes it something even better.
Yeah, and I think so talking about getting into sort of the personnel on this track, you've got again Lewis Johnson on bass, JR as we mentioned on drums. Then you've got the legendary Stevie Wonder playing on synth. Michael Jackson's on backing vocals. And that's kind of, I think, a testament to what a great vocalist James Ingram is, that you've got Michael Jackson singing back up to him on it.
Yeah, only Quincy Jones could get away with that one.
Yeah, you just know, and again, well, not again, but certainly something I was thinking before this which is worth mentioning, is if you haven't seen the documentary film Quincy, I think it's available on a lot of different platforms. You've got to check that out, because you just know for a fact that going into this album, he was just calling in all his favours, all his superstar friends, and they didn't people like Michael Jackson, Stevie Wonder, wouldn't have hesitated for a second coming in and doing this for him. But yeah, again, great track. And moving on to what I was saying before, the contrast in this gorgeous ballad, Just Once.
Yeah, a definite favourite of that, and you've got Abe Laboriel Senior on bass on this, which, I mean, there's a legendary player in his own right there. What a bass player he is, and then, of course, you've got David Foster on it as well, which is, I think, as you pointed out, you can really hear the style of that. You know who it is, and it's another one that's so recognisable that even though it's on a Quincy Jones album, you can tell who's on that, who specifically is on that track.
Yeah, and again, like I keep mentioning, of not realising who played on like these albums. Once I sort of was researching and saw that it was David Foster on this, it's one of those where you go, oh yeah, I can hear it now, and you realise, it's like, how did I not think of that before? I think what I wrote about it was that it's just like a perfect track. Again, the brilliance of Quincy Jones to pick which musicians to use on what tracks. And I'm sure this is one that he wrote and thought of David Foster probably straight away, because it is so similar to some of those ballads that he did with Earth, Wind and Fire. And then again on this track, you've got Steve Lukather again, totally chalk and cheese to what he played on I Know Corrida with his monster guitar solo. Then you've got him just playing a really laid back, funky thing on this.
But equally as brilliant.
And
if you know what I mean. It's like, to get, and it goes with all of these players who are on this, they can do the whole, look at me, big guitar solos, big drum solos, or whatever. But when you tell them to just sit in the groove, and they just will, and they just can.
Yeah.
And it takes a lot more to make a groove interesting than it would to make a solo interesting.
Yeah.
And that's where the big session players, I think, really make their name. It's when you can sit in a groove and you still can listen to it and go, Steve Lukather, that.
Yeah. And again, this is also features James Ingram again, and sort of one of the key songs that really launched his career, and all the amazing work he went on to do after this. And then again, next track, Bet You Wouldn't Hurt Me, which, again, the contrast in that, you've got Patty Austin on lead vocals, Lewis Johnson on bass again, Stevie Wonder again. another one of those tracks which like I said, similar with Asia. This is an album which I can listen all the way through and enjoy it. It's one that I kind of previously haven't thought a lot about, but listening again to it over the last couple of days, especially the chorus, it's just so classic Lewis Johnson on bass. You can really hear his stamp on it, his slap bass in the middle. You can, and his tone, it's just so him. But yeah, another fantastic track.
Yeah, for me, this album's one of those that for years it slipped under the radar. It's like I knew the probably the first 3 tracks, and I was like, they're great. But I'd never took the time to really listen through everything and really start to take it in. And when you do that, it just gives it a whole new life.
Yeah,
and it takes it again up a level from where it was to somewhere else.
And then moving on to the next track, Something Special. Again, Patty Austin on lead vocals, Herbie Hancock on piano, Lewis Johnson again, and not a lot to say about this track. Just again another fantastic track, and Patty Austin, somebody that I didn't really know much about before going into this, but certainly we're checking more of her out after this.
Some beautiful piano work on the whole album by Herbie Hancock. I mean, again, of all the people who Quincy could call, Herbie's right up there as one of the greatest piano players.
Yeah.
And he just put some absolute brilliance on all over this album.
And to say that he can do all the jazz and he does his own music, to then come in and do this session/studio work and just lay it down, it's
for sure
a testament to him. And then moving on to another track, which I think another one we sort of both knew before coming into it was Razzmatazz, which again, Patty Austin, Herbie Hancock again, Steve Lukather again, and what an absolute excellent horn arrangement on this one.
Yeah, I love the horns on Razzmatazz. It just and the feel of it as well. That kind of disco, but still with a bit of funk in there, with the horns on it. It just works. It just sits really, really nicely.
Yeah, and I think with that sort of disco feel, it becomes a bit more of a dance record than I don't know, like a classic sort of funk record. But yeah, awesome track
for sure.
And then track 7 on the album's again one of the most famous songs, I'd say, from the album. And again, just James Ingram just stealing the show on this one. I think this track is kind of one of those ones that launched him really. And you can have a look at the Grammys, the actual specific categories in which they won the Grammys for, but I think one of them was vocal performance, and I think it might have even been for this track. So
yeah, would make sense.
Yeah,
because the vocal work on it is just incredible.
Yeah, gorgeous ballad. And then the last 2 tracks were 2 that I certainly this next one, which I'm sure I pronounced wrong in Velas, is it's a track I really didn't know too much about. I've definitely heard it before, but probably just been on in the background. But looking into it today and yesterday, I mean, it is such a contrasting piece. It's an instrumental, the only instrumental on the album. And again, apologies for the pronunciation, but it features Toots Thielemans on harmonica, which, looking into him, has worked with just... It makes sense why he was on this album.
Yeah, for sure.
Worked with the likes of Oscar Peterson, Dizzy Gillespie, and he's actually, at that time especially, he was the most famous jazz harmonica player of all time. At that time, that doesn't make any sense actually, but I'll let that one slide down to the radar.
Yeah, we'll let that one go. But yeah, I mean, harmonica's not something you would think and really associate with jazz, and it's definitely not something you would stick on a funk album every day, but again, it was totally the right choice. and you know, Quincy knew what he was doing.
Yeah, and I mean, I knew he must be good to be on this album, but then researching it, it was like, okay, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
um, and then finishing off the album, which I think is just again with Asia and Josie. I think this is just a perfect ending to a perfect album. Turn on the Action, and on this one you've got Abe Laboriel on bass again, Steve Lukather again, Greg Fillinganes on synth, Herbie Hancock and Patty Austin taking the lead on this one, and once again fantastic horn arrangements. And I really think one of the standout things for me listening to it today was the backing vocals and how tight they are, especially in sort of the pre-chorus. It's so syncopated, and you know it must have been rehearsed endlessly to get it that tight. But
yeah, it's another almost Michael McDonald on Peg moment that we're looking at here. With how well crafted it was. In the backing vocals, and it's all well and good doing that as long as the song stands up to it, which in this case, of course, it absolutely does. And add that to the horn arrangements and everything just being so tight and well crafted. It just makes it a really great track, and as you say, it's a great end to the album.
I don't think we could have picked two better albums to kick off this little sort of series that we're looking into here. But wow.
It's doing a deep dive on an album is there's only a few albums that you would look at and you'd go, yeah, that really deserves it. But I think in the case of these two, it's been definitely some really deserving albums with some excellent tracks on, and I think we would both recommend you go and sit and just listen to them from top to bottom, and just enjoy the music, because that's what they're all about.
Absolutely highly recommend going and doing a little deep dive yourself into these albums, or any albums that like with us, that with these two albums, partly the reason we picked them is because we kind of already knew a bit about them, not as much as we do now.
Yeah, for sure.
But two of our favourite, mutually our favourite albums. So if you've got any favourite albums, I highly recommend just going and really looking into it, and you'll probably find out why you love them so much.
Yeah, it's one thing actually I quite miss about streaming, is when you have the vinyl or the CD and you can go and read the liner notes, which is always a favourite thing with any album. If you're really into the album, going and reading the liner notes and seeing who played on it. Now it's a trip to Wikipedia or a trip to AllMusic or wherever to try and find who was on what, and who played that, and who produced it, and where was it made, what studio was it done in. It's all fascinating just to deep dive down on an album and really understand it a lot more.
Yeah, I'm sure was the same with you, but it was like when I was a kid, and even not that long ago, when we would listen to CDs in the car, and even there were new ones that we got or things that we'd already listened to, my dad would always say, have a look inside, who played on this one, who did the bass on this, who did.
Oh, same. And I'll still buy CDs just for that. Even if I've got the album on Spotify or streaming it or whatever, I will still actively go out and buy the CDs. As anyone watching can see just there, I've got a few stacks of CDs out behind me here, but I still take pleasure listening to them, and you get that experience where you're listening to it, you're looking at the cover, you're looking at the liner notes, and just that physical media for me will always stand above the internet and the streaming thing, as even though we're probably both of the streaming generation, doesn't mean doesn't mean it's our favourite.
Yeah, and I think that's quite a nice way to sort of round off the episode. I know for a fact we're going to do more of this.
Oh, for sure.
make sure to. I'm going to let you take the lead on checking out, going to the links and everything. What are they?
Yes. So you can find us on Facebook or Instagram at Groovecast UK, and you can head to my website charliesmithdrummer.com/groovecast to find all of our previous episodes and all of the details about us.
Yeah, so we hope you've enjoyed this special episode of Groovecast, and we'll see you next time.